This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 429 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week was pretty good on this matchup show. I did well with quarterback streamers, running back was generally fine, and I hit on Marquise Brown, Darius Slayton, and Jamison Crowder. I didn't see the uptick in target share for T.Y. Hilton coming, but I'd say overall it was a pretty strong week, probably the best of the season. So hopefully we can continue into week 6. Now before digging in with the Kansas City Chiefs and Buffalo Bills set to face off on Monday night, FanDuel Sportsbook is giving you enhanced odds on the game. New users can place up to a $5 bet and grab the defending Super Bowl champion Chiefs at plus 2,500 odds to take down the Buffalo Bills. That's right, a $5 bet can earn you $125. So download the FanDuel Sportsbook app now and make your first deposit to see the enhanced odds. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado, West Virginia, or Indiana. New users only. Must wager on designated boost market. Deposit required. Max bonus $125. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. And in Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. That's a lot of words. I had to read the disclaimer. Let's get to this week's matchup show. The way people are viewing quarterbacks this week seems to be on point. I don't really have any disagreements on the negative end. So I figured I'd talk about a handful of fringe starters or quarterback streamers on today's show. And the first is Kirk Cousins. He was pretty average last week, but a lot of that had to do with an unexpected first half where there wasn't that much scoring overall in the game. And that was against Seattle. The game against Atlanta this week has a 54.5 point over-under, and in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed, no team has been friendlier to quarterbacks this year than the Atlanta Falcons. I do think Cousins should be fine in this matchup. There's some worry that we see another below expectation performance from the Falcons, but if they play to the level that we know that they can play at, that'll be good for Cousins because he'll have to keep up the pace. Minnesota won't just be able to be this run-heavy team like they want to. You could also look to Ryan Fitzpatrick. I talked about Fitzmagic on yesterday's 10 Trends show, noting how he's been the QB3 in fantasy football since taking over his job again back in week 7 of last year. He's now had 3 straight QB1 performances, and he gets the Jets defense this week that's nothing special against the pass. Most importantly, though, Miami's got the 5th highest implied team total on this week's slate. Their implied total is 28 points. We don't see that often with Miami, so I would play Fitzpatrick pretty confidently. And then lastly, one of the 15 transactions players from this week, there's Andy Dalton. That Dallas-Arizona game has a 55-point over-under right now over on FanDuel Sportsbook. And the Cowboys are just 2.5 point underdogs. Arizona also ranks as the 8th most advantageous matchup according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers. And like I said on the show a couple of days ago, you're really trusting in the Dallas pass catchers to help Dalton here. It's not like Dalton's some scrub quarterback either. We've seen him finish as a QB1 in fantasy football in the past. We've seen him elevate multiple players in his offense. Just because he's not Dak Prescott doesn't mean he's automatically bad. I do expect the Cowboys to be less pass-heavy than they were with Dak under center. On the season in neutral game scripts, Dallas ranks 8th in pass rate, and they've been the most pass-heavy team in overall ratio. Even still, Dalton is in play as a solid QB2 or streamer this week. Myles Gaskin is not getting the love that he deserves in the fantasy community. This is a repeat from what I talked about yesterday. But he's seen about a 70% running back rush share per game over his last 3 to go along with about an 18% target share over this time. And with Jordan Howard out this past week, he was the back who handled all of the work close to the end zone. And now he gets the Jets, a team ranking as the 4th best matchup to opposing running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. He's a locked-in RB2, but he's not being ranked that way, and I really don't understand it. We've been waiting for the confidence to play Cam Akers, and I think he's fine this week if you need a back, which a lot of you probably do because they're bye weeks. And let's be honest, the running back landscape is not very deep. It's not like it's easy to get production off of your waiver wire. Akers only saw a 28% running back rush share last week, but Sean McVay talked about him getting more touches this week. And it's a good matchup against a beat-up 49ers defense. You still have to go Henderson over Akers. But like I talked about on yesterday's show, running back production in fantasy can often be coaching driven. And it wouldn't surprise me if we see more work for Akers than we saw this past week, especially since he was effective on his limited touches. Adrian Peterson is most definitely in play too. He's seen about 75% of Detroit's running back rushes over their last 2 games, and this week, they're 3.5-point favorites against the team that ranks as the second best matchup for running backs when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. And by the way, I keep bringing up adjusted fantasy points allowed. That's just schedule adjusted. So it adjusts for the matchups that these teams have faced. So I like Adrian Peterson in this spot. Now, I mentioned this last week, but the game didn't play, so it didn't matter. But Rex Burkhead is a scary start. We've got Damian Harris as the early down guy there right now. And in the Patriots' last game, James White came back and he had a 23% target share. Rex Burkhead's target share went from 13% to 36%, all the way down to just 3% with James White back. So I'm not confident in Burkhead's projected workload at all. You may be considering him as a flex, but I think there's too much of a risk. And the same kind of goes for J.K. Dobbins. I liked Dobbins last week as a deeper play, and he was the RB30, so he was fine. But his peripherals are not very good. He's seen just 17% of the team's running back rushes and 7.5% of the team's targets this year. And he hasn't come close to his 31% running back rush share that he saw all the way back in week 1. Back when we had a lot more hope for J.K. Dobbins here in 2020. Baltimore also gets Philadelphia. That's a team that's been well above average against running backs this year. Really what I'm saying here with both Burkhead and Dobbins is that if I'm going to target a running back in a split backfield like this, either the matchup has to be awesome like we saw last week with Dobbins, or he's got to be in line for a lot of targets. And Dobbins' target share isn't nearly high enough in a run-heavy offense to justify playing him with confidence. A lot of people are ready to give up on Juju Smith-Schuster. I've seen it all over Twitter, and I totally understand why, trust me. He's been a sell on the 15 transaction show this season for a reason. So I'm clearly there. His average depth of target sucks, and he's not making up for that with a high target share. But I do like him this week. I really like him. Cleveland's been arguably the worst team against players coming out of the slot this season, ranking second in percentage of targets that have gone to that area of the field, first in yards allowed, first in touchdowns allowed, and first in receptions allowed to the slot. Meanwhile, Juju has continued to play that role for Pittsburgh. He's played 80% of his snaps from the slot this year, according to PFF. I've said all season long that people have been ranking Juju too high, but I think he's a good play this week. Don't be too discouraged by last week's performance. That's basically what I wanted to say. Laviska Shenault has now seen his target share rise from 14.6% in week 3 to 16.7% in week 4, and then to 18.2% in week 5. He's being utilized more in the passing game, which is great to see instead of him being used as sort of like a gadget player. And he gets Detroit this week. That game has a high over-under, and the Lions rank 9th worst in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So I think Laviska is a good play. Preston Williams saw his target share at 18.5% this past Sunday. The highest target share that we've seen from him since week 1. And that's good news. Like I've been saying all show, the Dolphins face the Jets this week, and the Jets have a very beatable defense. They've been below average against wide receivers, which makes Williams a deeper play given the target share that we saw from him last week. There's obviously some volatility there, but I want pieces of this Miami offense. DJ Moore right now is being ranked inside the top 20 over on Fantasy Pros. I'm less bullish than other rankers are. Chicago's been the second best team this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and even though Moore had that big play for a touchdown last week against Atlanta, he still only had a 14.3% target share. He's now failed to reach a 17% share in each of his last 3 games. That's scary. I know I've had Moore as a buy this year, but this is frightening. This is a little bit scary. Robbie Anderson has been the top receiver for them. There's no doubt. That shouldn't be argued. And there are players that are ranked below Moore this week, like Justin Jefferson, for example, who I would play ahead of him. And then there's Terry McLaurin. Look, I love Terry McLaurin as a talent, but we know that his situation sucks. And what sucks even more is that he's going to get James Bradberry this weekend. And Bradberry has been one of the better cornerbacks this year in terms of yards allowed per snap, according to Pro Football Focus. Top wide receivers have not done a whole lot against the Giants this year. Deontay Johnson was the wide receiver 45 against them in week 1. Allen Robinson, the wide receiver 78. Brandon Ayuk only finished in the top 20 because of a rushing touchdown. Robert Woods was the wide receiver 47. And Amari Cooper last week was the wide receiver 80. James Bradbury is very, very good. I think that you still have to play McLaurin, but it's not as easy as a matchup as people might think. The tight end position continues to be very bad. Low-end tight end ones in fantasy football are essentially guys who see like 10 to 12% target shares each week. It's bad out there. So finding deeper plays is tough, but I've got 2 of them for you this week. One is a guy that I talked about on yesterday's show, and that's Irv Smith, the guy who I touted before the season started, like an idiot. Smith saw his second highest target share of the season last week against Seattle. He ran more routes than Kyle Rudolph, and he gets Atlanta this week, and Atlanta has been the absolute worst at defending tight ends this year in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed. It's a dart throw play, don't get me wrong, but hopefully this is the start of a positive trend for Irv. And then there's also Trey Burton. This is even deeper than Irv Smith. I don't love the idea of going to Burton because there was some talk this week that the Colts want to involve Mo Alley Cox more, which they should. They absolutely should. You guys know that I'm a Mo Alley Cox truther. But Burton ran twice as many routes as Mack this past week, and he's seen an 18% and 19% target share in his 2 games played this year. 2 games that he's played since returning from injury. The matchup is fine against Cincinnati, and the Colts have an implied team total above 27. So he's in play as a streamer. I just wouldn't expect the world. I wouldn't expect the world from any non-elite tight end at this point. At defense this week, I like the New York Giants, just like I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show. They rank in the top half of the league in pressure rate this year, and Washington, their opponent, they've been below average in pressure rate allowed, and they've also allowed the highest sack rate. With a low over-under, the Giants are a good streamer. And you could even look at the opposite side of that game, that exact same game, and go with Washington if you wanted to. Daniel Jones continues to be a turnover machine, and the Giants are well below average in pressure rate allowed, while we know Washington's defensive line can get to the quarterback. So feel free to use Washington too. And you can even go with the Miami Dolphins. I might as well just talk about the Dolphins at every single level of the podcast this week. Just going back to that pressure rate data, Miami's been slightly below average in pressure rate this year. We know their defense isn't that good, but the Jets are dead last in pressure rate allowed. So not sack rate allowed, but pressure rate allowed. With Joe Flacco under center again this week and Miami has double-digit favorites, you can use the Dolphins defense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. One more show this week, the mailbag episode. That will drop tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.